Hey guys, this is your host Eric. Today we are going to watch action genre movie called There Are No Saints. Spoilers ahead, turn on your subtitle, I greatly appreciate your support. Enjoy the video. The film begins with a scene of a male prisoner named Neto Nta, who has been imprisoned for several years for a serious crime. Neto is known to have murdered 371 people, including women and children, before surrendering to them. He murdered a woman and a boy in his most recent crime. He felt terrible about himself and decided to turn himself into the police. Neto was finally released on parole by the police agency several years after completing his prison sentence, thanks to the assistance of one of his male colleagues, Carl Abrahams. Many police officers despise Neto and are outraged by his release because the crimes he committed are heinous. They believe that dangerous people like him deserve to be imprisoned for life. Carl is willing to spend money to get Neto out of jail because he owes Neto a lot on the way to the hotel where Neto will be staying. Carl immediately provides him with everything he requires, including a cell phone, car passport, and $30,000 to begin a new life. Neto was stretching in his hotel room that night when he heard the alarm sound from his car, so he went out to check on the situation. Unfortunately, when he came out of his room, he was beaten and attacked with bats by a group of police officers. Neto does not resist or counteract the police because he realizes the attack was a ruse to get him back into prison. The cops despise him and believe that people with a dark past, such as him, can never be forgiven. Neto returned to his room after the beating and treated the bruises on his face. Nando went to his ex-wife Nadia's house the next morning to meet his son Julia and unwind after being separated for years. When Julio saw him after he had been released from prison, he ran to hug him with joy. Julia was pleased with his presence, but when he learns that Nto will not be living in the house with him, Julio is disappointed. Julio explains that their living situation has deteriorated because Nadia's boyfriend Vincent is constantly rude and scolds them. Julio went on to say that Vincent would not hesitate to hit Nadia if she made a mistake. Given that Vincent would return to their house soon after she asked Neto to return to the hotel, he had time to take some photos of Truliu before he left. Neto recalled Julie's remark about Vincent while looking at his photo. So, if he wants to find out Vincent's true identity in the evening, Nina goes to a bar owned by his old friend Baylor, a well-known Mexican gangster boss. He inquired about Vincent Baylor's origins and background. Vincent was a fairly successful real estate entrepreneur, according to IN. He still ran an illegal business and collaborated with drug cartels from southern Mexico in the business of smuggling arms. The next day, Nano decides to follow Nadia in secret in order to locate Vincent's base. After a long journey, they arrived at a long-abandoned factory, where she entered to ask Vincent for a monthly salary. When Neto returned to his hotel, Julio was waiting for him in front of his room. He immediately brought Julio into the room to rest while viewing some photographs Julio had taken earlier in the day. Julio was driven back to Nadia's house by Nto before he went to a parking lot to eat some burgers in the car. Neto received a short message from Nadia while eating his dinner, telling him to stay away from Julio because she knew he had many enemies who could endanger Julio's life. Neto reluctantly agreed to her request because he knew he couldn't always be with Julio. He stared intently at the gang of thugs and immediately put up a fight after a group of men suddenly appeared and surrounded Neto's car while pointing guns at him. Even though he had to deal with several armed people, Neto was able to defeat them when they fired shots. He even managed to blow up the car of one of the thugs attempting to flee the scene. When Neto returns to the hotel in the evening, he receives a call from Julio informing him that their home is currently under attack. When he heard the news, he rushed to Nadia's house before something bad happened to Nadia and their son. Unfortunately, it was too late because Nadia was already dead on the floor, covered in blood and lifeless. Shortly after realizing that the perpetrator of the attack was her lover Vincent, who intended to kidnap Julio, one of Vincent's men pointed a gun at Neto and threatened him not to resist. However, Neto was able to quickly defeat him and snatch the gun from his grasp before a gunfight erupted between them. Unfortunately, by the time Neto had defeated all of Vincent's men, Vincent had already fled with Julio. Shortly after Vincent's car drove away, police officers arrived, believing Neto was responsible for Nadia's death. He had to flee that location because the incident had made him a wanted man by the police. That night, Neto meets with Carl under the flyover to ask for assistance in finding Vincent, who has been kidnapped. According to Julio, Carl, who has many connections with the gangsters, Neto can begin the search by meeting with one of Vincent's business partners, Jet Rink, an illegal arms dealer who gets supplies from Vincent. After receiving money and a car from Carl Mando, they rush to Jet Rink's nightclub. While at the nightclub, he inquired about Jet Rink's location with the female bartender Inns. Then she tells him he can ask Jet Rink's girlfriend Kali to drive him to Jet Rink's house. After Mando gives Kali some money, she agrees to take him to Jet Rink's house and introduce him to Jet. When he arrived at Jet Rink's house, He pretended to be one of Vincent's clients tasked with inspecting all of Jet Rink's weapons. When Jet Rink heard those words, he realized Neto had lied because Jet Rink was a close friend of Vincent's who knew for certain who was Vincent's client when Jet Rink was about to open fire on him. He'd already shot at Jet Rink's leg and purposefully stepped on the gunshot wound. After NLL obtained information about Vincent's whereabouts, he immediately took some of Jet Rink's money and left the house. Neto then returns to the nightclub to ask Inez for assistance in posing as his wife in order to cross the Mexican state border to Vincent's hideout. Not long after, 3 young men attacked him while he was in the bathroom, but Neto easily defeated them. After receiving a large sum of money, Inez decides to assist him and poses as his wife. They were able to pass the border checkpoint because the border police officers were too focused on Inez's sexy body, just as he had predicted. Neto allowed Inez to return home the next day after they arrived at an inn because her task had been completed. However, after discovering that his motivation for doing all of this was to save his son, Inez felt compelled to assist him further for a fee that was double the previous agreement. Inez will seduce Vincent while pretending to buy an apartment in order to obtain information from him. She couldn't get much information from him at the first meeting, but she still had a chance to learn more. The unexpected happens at their next meeting. The next night when Inez meets Vincent at his main headquarters for a drink, he slapped her and pointed a gun at her head because he knew she was approaching him on someone's orders. Fortunately, NTO arrived on time and immediately killed every guard in Vincent's house before finally beating and arresting Vincent. Neto tortured Vincent by handcuffing and tying him to a chair, pouring hot water on his legs and cutting his fingers and nails to burn his hands with them. Vincent, who was no longer able to stand the torture, was forced to confess to Neto that he had sold Julio to a human trafficker named Sons, who was known to kidnap celebrities. Vincent frequently admitted that he was forced to do all of this because he needed to earn a lot of money to pay off his business debt. Nando immediately contacted Baylor after hearing his son's name to find out where his human trafficking headquarters were. When Neto returns to the hotel, he tells Inez that this task is too dangerous for her safety. However, it turns out that Inez still wishes to assist him so that he can meet his only son the following day. When Neto and Inez were at Son's boxing gym, he unexpectedly asked several men who were Sons. When he arrived at the gym, several men attacked him from behind and kidnapped him. The car carrying Inez was the first to leave, while the car carrying Neto was far behind. Despite his handcuffs, he could easily beat Sons' men and take control of the steering wheel to follow the car carrying Inez. After a long journey, Mendo arrived at a hideout in the forest and discovered where he was being held along with other kidnapped victims. Unfortunately, Sons' men caught him and brought Neto in front of their boss Sons. When Sons noticed Neto's arrival, he immediately showed Julio, who was hanging upside down above a well filled with cold water. He then explains that buying Jewel from Vincent was not a coincidence, but was part of his plan to exact revenge on Net. He wishes to exact revenge on Neto for his previous actions, in which he murdered his wife and son without mercy. Neto attempted to rebel and put up a fight after witnessing the incident, making Sons' men angry and intending to kill him. Surprisingly, Sons killed his subordinates who were on the verge of killing Neto because he didn't want Neto to die before witnessing his death. Sons approached Neto and forced him to watch Julio's body, which had died after being drowned for several minutes after all of Sons died. Nato used his remaining strength to kill Sons and free all the hostages before carrying Julio's lifeless body. Neto opened the trunk of the car where he kept Baylor the next day after burying his beloved son properly. Baylor was found to be the one who had leaked all of the information about Ndio and his family, including information about Vincent and Julio to Sons. After all that Neto had been through, he was forced to return to his old life, where he had to continue killing and injuring others without mercy. We really appreciate you watching. If you enjoy this video, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel with the notification bell because it is really important for us. Thank you.